Greetings, everyone. I'm here to assist you today. If you're using this video to drift off, take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel before you doze off. What's your location, and what time are you tuning in right now? Unwind and take a moment for yourself. Camping was meant to be our perfect escape. My brother Lucas, along with a few friends, and I, loaded up our gear, brimming with excitement for a weekend immersed in nature, far from the city's clamor and the relentless buzz of our phones. The prospect of unplugging was thrilling. We had camped before, but this time we were venturing deeper into the woods to a hidden gem that Lucas discovered in an outdoor activities forum. We sought the perfect escape, a tranquil, hidden outdoor haven away from the crowds. The journey felt endless, winding along narrow mountain roads that appeared to go on for miles. Upon arriving at the trailhead, we were greeted by the refreshing, crisp air. Amidst a powerful aroma, devoid of cellular connection and surrounded by an absence of other vehicles. In the idyllic forest, we strolled for about an hour, sharing laughter and stories, our backpacks brimming with food, tents, and all the necessities for our adventure. It felt absolutely amazing to be there, far removed from the entire trail. At last, we arrived at a serene clearing, embraced by majestic trees and accompanied by the gentle sound of a nearby bubbling creek. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and looked forward to a tranquil night beneath the stars. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and engaging in light-hearted conversation about everything and nothing. The night enveloped us quickly, with the only illumination coming from the dancing flames and the twinkling stars overhead. It was a rare kind of silence, one that city life seldom offers, peaceful, almost too peaceful. At one point, Lucas stood up and wandered off, mentioning he needed to check something by the creek. He returned shortly, his expression oddly intriguing. "Guys, some of you went to the creek," he said. As he inquired softly, we all exchanged glances and shook our heads. None of us had ventured near the water since our arrival. "Look, there are footprints," Lucas remarked, his gaze sweeping through the shadows. Beyond the fire, I initially assumed he was just kidding, attempting to set the stage for a horror tale. However, the look on his face revealed the truth. He was dead serious. The gravity of the situation unsettled me. Jake, one of our companions, recoiled. "Perhaps a hiker passed by earlier," Lucas muttered, though I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The remainder of the night unfolded quietly, yet an unsettling feeling clung to the air around us. Each crack of a branch or whisper of leaves had me glancing back over my shoulder. I convinced myself it was merely my imagination. After all, we were surrounded by the woods, so it was only natural to hear sounds. At last, we found ourselves in the woods. We slipped into the tents, zipped them up tight, and nestled into our sleeping bags. The forest enveloped us in a hush, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the gentle rustle of branches swaying in the breeze. In the stillness of the night, I suddenly found myself awake, though the reason for my awakening eludes me. There was a noise, or perhaps it was just an unsettling feeling that something was amiss. My tent felt cramped, and I could hear Lucas's steady breathing as he slept beside me. Everything appeared normal, yet I couldn't dismiss the nagging sense that something was off. I slowly unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The campfire had dwindled to embers, casting a soft glow across the campsite. The trees loomed like shadowy guardians, their branches gently swaying in the breeze. Then I spotted them. Footprints, not just in the creek this time, but also encircling our tents, large and unmistakable against the ground. My heart raced as I cautiously stepped outside, struggling to grasp the reality before me. The footprints were undeniably oversized, clearly not belonging to any of us, and they were fresh. It appeared that someone or something had been wandering around our camp while we were asleep. I crouched low to examine them more closely, my fingers tracing the contours of one of the impressions in the ground, which was notably deep enough to imply that the creator was significantly heavy. I scanned my surroundings, yearning for a glimpse of someone or something lurking in the shadows, yet found only emptiness. As I made my way back to the tent, the trees loomed around me, and an unsettling silence enveloped the night. My thoughts raced, contemplating whether I should disturb the others from their slumber. What could I possibly share with them? In the end, they were merely footprints. Perhaps it was nothing, but sleep eluded me. I felt abandoned, attuned to every faint sound outside the store, my mind replaying the image of those footprints incessantly. The following morning, I chose not to mention what I had seen, reasoning that there was no need to alarm anyone over footprints that could easily have a rational explanation, perhaps a hiker or an animal, and I was simply overreacting. We spent the day exploring the area, wandering through the woods and visiting a nearby waterfall, which was stunning, even serene. Yet, the sensation of being watched lingered, and occasionally I caught Lucas glancing around, his shoulders tense in a way that mirrored my own. That night, as we gathered around the fire once more, the mood had shifted. Laughter felt subdued, conversation strained, and an unspoken tension hung in the air, as if we all sensed something was amiss but were reluctant to voice it. Eventually, Jake rose to his feet and stretched his limbs. "I'm heading to bed," he remarked. "Tomorrow promises to be a full day ahead." The others expressed their consensus with a nod. After a long and exhausting day, it was clear that everyone was in need of some well-deserved rest. As I prepared to settle into my tent, I spotted a few more footprints nearby. This time, they weren't merely lingering by the tents. They were making their way toward the woods, as if someone had been standing just outside our camp and then decided to walk away. I stood still, my gaze fixed on the footprints. They were undeniably fresh, almost too fresh. Lucas leaned in, signaling discreetly, his eyes tracking mine as his expression drained of color at the sight before us. "We need to go," he whispered softly. Text, I refrained from discussing it. It was incorrect, and remaining here was no longer viable. We quietly gathered our belongings, careful not to disturb those still asleep. Just as we prepared to depart, a sound shattered the stillness, a low, menacing growl emanating from the shadowy depths of the forest. We stood still, our gaze locked in the shadows. Beyond the trees, the growl echoed nearer. A chill raced down my spine. What lurked in the shadows was neither a bear nor a friend. Rouse them from slumber. With a subtle quiver in his voice, Lucas whispered urgently. I shook Jake and the others, striving to maintain my composure as I detailed the unfolding situation. Initially, they were disoriented and groggy, but the palpable fear in my tone seemed to awaken their senses, making it clear that something was amiss. We gathered our belongings and started to retrace our steps along the path. The growl reverberated through the trees, my heart raced in my chest, and my thoughts spiraled into the darkest possibilities, every shadow looming ominously. Every branch seemed to shift, creasing as if something was drawing nearer with each step we took. The growl faded into an unsettling silence. I kept glancing over my shoulder, anticipating something to leap from the shadows and attack us, yet nothing appeared. We continued our journey in a charged silence, the only noise being the soft rustle of leaves beneath our boots. After what felt like an eternity, we finally arrived at the car, tossed our belongings into the trunk, and climbed inside, slamming the doors behind us. With trembling hands, Lucas retrieved the keys, igniting the engine and illuminating the surroundings. The headlights cast a glow on the trees ahead, yet all we found was emptiness. The forest stood still and silent around us. We drove in quiet contemplation for what felt like an eternity, the tension gradually fading as we stepped away. All I can say is that I've never returned to those woods, and I doubt I ever will. The evening unfolded like any typical night in my new apartment. I was still acclimating to the creaks and groans of the aged structure, the sort of noises you convince yourself are merely pipes or the wind whispering through a tiny fissure. Yet, in solitude, those sounds become magnified. In the stillness of the world outside, where silence reigns and your thoughts are your only companions, I found myself having moved out just a week ago. The apartment, though unremarkable, was a cozy one-bedroom nestled on the top floor of an aging four-story building. The rent was absurdly low. It should have raised a red flag, yet back then, I was indifferent. That evening, I found myself glued to the TV, seeking a moment of relaxation after a demanding day at the office. Finally, I powered down for the night. I freshened up my smile and settled into bed. As the clock struck 1 a.m., I surrendered to the stillness of the apartment, allowing the quiet to wrap around me like a comforting blanket. At first, I thought I was dreaming. A faint sound, like footsteps, echoed from upstairs while I was on the top floor. My initial thought was that the building was settling. After all, old structures make noise. I attempted to brush it off, but the steps persisted slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking from one end of the apartment to the other, right above my head. My heart raced as I lay still in bed, listening intently. It was real. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was moving upstairs, but that couldn't be right. There was no attic, no other floor. I racked my brain for a logical explanation. Perhaps there was a storage space above me. Perhaps an animal had found its way into the roof space, yet the footsteps were too heavy, too distinctly human. I reached for my phone and activated the flashlight, carefully making my way out of bed. The footsteps echoed rhythmically, reminiscent of a steady stride. As I entered the hallway, my beam sliced through the shadows. Suddenly, the footsteps ceased, plunging everything into complete silence. I paused, anticipation hanging in the air, yet nothing came. The apartment is enveloped in a serene stillness. A shiver ran down my spine. I found myself lost in a world of imagination. I reassured myself that it was merely my imagination running wild. Additionally, I returned to bed. It took me a bit to drift back to sleep the following morning, and I nearly brushed it aside. However, upon returning home from work, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The apartment had an unusual odor. A musty odor lingered in the air, reminiscent of something forgotten and sealed away for far too long, emanating from the ceiling that night. I attempted to reassure myself that it was merely a figment of my imagination, but then, at 2 a.m., the footsteps returned, more pronounced this time, as if someone was intent on making their presence known. Fear sent shivers down my spine. With a deliberate motion, I raised my phone, my thoughts swirling in a tug-of-war over the next step to take. Reach out to the landlord. Contact the authorities before I could make a choice. The footsteps ceased, followed by a resounding crash. It felt as though a weighty object had crashed onto the floor above, only to be followed by an even more unsettling noise, something creeping, something substantial dragging across the surface. My heart raced, making it difficult to gather my thoughts. I was torn. The urge to flee the apartment clashed with the instinct to remain, fully aware that whatever lurked nearby was uncomfortably close. So, I stayed put. The bed lay still, a silent witness to the night's unsettling sounds. I listened intently until the noise faded away, but sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. The next morning, I reached out to the landlord, sharing my concerns about the disturbances and inquiring about any potential space above my apartment. His reaction was one of surprise. He assured me there was nothing up there, claiming the building lacked an attic. My stomach dropped at his words. "Are you absolutely certain?" I inquired, making an effort to maintain my composure. "Absolutely," he replied. "Perhaps it's the plumbing." His voice lacked conviction as he assured me someone would come to investigate. In that moment, I sensed his disbelief. Days slipped by without any sign of footsteps returning, yet the unsettling feeling of being watched lingered. Each time I entered my apartment, the musty odor was accompanied by an eerie sensation, as if something decayed was just beyond my view. Then, one night, I heard it again, no footsteps this time, just a soft tapping, like someone gently touching the wall above my bed. The tapping grew more urgent, and my heart raced in my chest. I gradually raised my phone, activated the flashlight, and directed it towards the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat. The ceiling crack, where the knocks echoed ominously, was fresh and gradually expanding, as if something unseen was pressing from beyond. I stepped back, my skin slick with cold sweat. The noise ceased abruptly, yet the fissure lingered. Without a moment's hesitation, I snatched my keys and bolted from the apartment, leaving the lights on and the door ajar. I raced to a friend's house, seeking refuge for the night, too frightened to share the reason for my sudden arrival in the dead of night. The following morning, I reached out to the landlord once more, emphasizing the urgent need for someone to inspect the roof. A few hours later, I received your call. The maintenance technician inspected the area and confirmed that there's nothing present, and the crack I inquired about has been addressed. No cracks here. I never returned after that. I terminated my lease and relocated in under a week. Even now, the mysteries of that apartment elude me, yet one truth remains clear. Some places are best left undisturbed. Isn't it fascinating how your instincts take charge before your mind even catches up while navigating a trail? Relishing the tranquility, the fragrance of the trees, the gentle rustle of leaves beneath my feet, all appeared to be in order until, suddenly, it came to a halt. As I drifted through my thoughts, an unsettling sensation washed over me, a nagging feeling that something was amiss. It's the kind of instinct you can't quite articulate, yet deep down, you know it's a warning not to dismiss. I discovered my true self. I often embarked on solo hikes, especially in this lesser-known park, where I relished the tranquility of fewer visitors, no crowds, no noise, just the serene embrace of nature and myself. This hidden trail was absent from the official map. I discovered it during a prior hike, a slender path that veered away from the main route and delved further into the heart of the forest. The previous visit left me wanting more. Today, I was eager to dive in and discover everything this place has to offer. As I ventured deeper, the world around me grew increasingly hushed. The familiar melodies of the forest, the chirping birds, and the rustling squirrels slowly vanished, leaving only the gentle whisper of the wind and the rhythm of my footsteps. Initially, I didn't perceive it as unsettling. Rather, it felt serene. The trees loomed taller here, ancient sentinels with branches weaving a dense canopy overhead. The sunlight struggled to penetrate, creating elongated shadows that danced across the ground. Yet, in an instant, the sensation of being observed crept in. I halted in dry, attuned to the silence around me. Just the wind, yet the hair on the back of my neck prickled with unease. I scanned the trees for any sign of movement, but there was no one around. I tried to shake off the sensation and continued walking, convincing myself that I was simply being paranoid. After all, I was deep in the forest. It was only natural to feel a bit uneasy. However, as I ventured further, that feeling intensified, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move from the shadows. Then, I spotted it, a figure in the distance, standing motionless in the middle of the path. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, about 30 meters away, staring right at me. No, I discerned the outlines, just the shadow of a tall figure, frozen in place for an instant. I thought about turning back. It was, after all, not unusual to encounter someone on a trail. Indeed, this time, it was unlike anything else. His stillness was unsettling, almost unnaturally so. He emerged without a whisper, no footsteps, no rustling leaves, absolutely nothing. I waved my hand at him, attempting to appear carefree. "Hello," I called. My voice echoed in the stillness. No response came. The man remained still, his gaze fixed on me. Though his face remained hidden, I could sense his intense gaze fixed upon me. Every fiber of my being urged me to turn back and escape, yet my legs remained frozen in place. I reassured myself that all was well. It could have been just another hiker passing by, or maybe I had strayed from my path, but an unsettling feeling lingered in the air. He felt a pang of guilt. I advanced cautiously, my gaze locked on him, and in response to my movement, he mirrored my step. I paused in dry. He too, a chill coursed down my spine. I stepped back, giving it a try. He mirrored my actions, but this time, as he moved forward, my heart raced. Moreover, I was unaware of the situation, yet I was certain I preferred to remain in the dark. As I turned and began my descent down the trail, I resisted the urge to glance back at least for the first minute. I was powerless to resist. He was trailing behind me. I caught sight of him through the trees, still far off, yet steadily approaching. He moved with a deliberate pace, as if he possessed an endless supply of time. What started as a leisurely walk quickly transformed into a brisk jog, and before I knew it, I was running. Regardless of how absurd he may have appeared to me, I was certain I had the path wound and turned, and for a fleeting moment, the man slipped from view, yet the unsettling sensation of being pursued lingered on. My breath came in uneven gasps, and my legs ignited with a fiery intensity as I pushed myself to run faster. I was aware that the main trail was close, yet it seemed as though I had been running for an eternity. As I emerged from the dense trees and reached the main path, I paused, breathless and panting. My lungs felt like they were on fire, and my heart raced so fiercely that I could hear it thundering in my ears. I turned around, anticipating a figure emerging from the forest behind me, but the scene was devoid of life. The path lay empty, with only the trees gently swaying in the breeze. No footprints, no shadows, nothing to suggest I had ever been there. I paused for a moment, attempting to grasp the reality of what had just unfolded. I had envisioned the entire scenario. It was merely my imagination at work. A deceptive trick that Law had witnessed was undeniably real and had trailed behind me. I chose not to dwell on it any longer. I dashed to the parking lot, hopped into my car, and secured the doors. With trembling hands, I glanced at the clock and turned the key in the ignition. I glanced at the rearview mirror repeatedly as I drove away from the park, anticipating the sight of him lingering by the roadside. But the road behind me was empty. The space was devoid of anything. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched for days. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told myself it had just been some weird guy in the woods, maybe someone who had gotten lost, maybe someone playing a joke, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. It was the way that it had moved, the way it had imitated me, step by step, the way it had faded away, as if it had never been there. A week later, I went back to the park, this time during the day, and with a friend we stayed on the main trails. It all seemed normal, quiet, but when we got to the point where the little trail separated from the main path, I stopped. The trail had disappeared. I walked to where I remembered it should be, but there was nothing. No opening in the trees, no sign that it had ever existed. "You're sure it was here?" my friend asked. I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I knew I'd been there. I'd walked it, but now it was like it had never existed. I didn't go back to that park. After that I had no intention of taking the unmarked trail. It was one of those decisions that seem harmless at the moment, like taking a different route to work just to see something new. I was doing a solo hike in a national park that I had visited many times before, following the same old trails. Suddenly, I spotted a narrow, nearly concealed path branching off from the main road. Had I not been paying close attention, I likely would have overlooked it entirely. Despite the absence of signage and any markings to reveal its destination, an undeniable allure drew me in. Perhaps it was a sense of curiosity, or perhaps a longing to discover something fresh. For a brief moment, I paused, gazing at the gap between the trees, and then I leapt into the unknown. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. It became colder and quieter, a departure from the familiar tranquility of the forest. Instead, there was an unusual stillness, as if the trees themselves were pausing, holding their breath in anticipation. The trail wound its way through the trees, their branches reaching out as if to embrace one another. As the sunlight progressed, it struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, creating elongated, slender shadows on the forest floor. I pressed on, searching for a way to veer back toward the main road, yet the path seemed to draw me further into the heart of the woods. Initially, I basked in the sensation of solitude, as though I had discovered a secret nook within the park. A hidden corner of the park, a place untouched by others. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves and the gentle rustle of branches in the wind. Yet, after 20 minutes, the thrill began to wane. The path ahead didn't loop back as I had anticipated, and still, there was no sign of another hiker. Then discomfort crept in, a tingling sensation at the nape of my neck, an almost imperceptible feeling as if someone were watching me. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was merely my imagination. But with each step, the sensation intensified, becoming impossible to ignore. I paused, scanning my surroundings, just trees, just shadows, nothing more. The forest was no matter where I looked, everything appeared the same. Yet an unsettling feeling lingered, hinting that something was amiss. A gentle rustling of leaves caught my attention, hinting at movement among the trees nearby. My heart raced. I turned my gaze toward the source of the noise, carefully examining the darkness. The serene stillness of the trees enveloped everything. "Hello," I called, my voice softer than I anticipated. In the stillness, an unsettling sensation of being observed grew stronger. I glanced at my phone, wishing to rely on the GPS for guidance, even in the absence of a signal. With a resigned sigh, I pivoted and retraced my steps. I prefer not to proceed without a clear destination, yet as I gazed down, I came to a halt. The trail had vanished. I searched with my eyes, yearning to spot the trail of bare earth peeking through the leaves, yet found nothing, only a thick cover of foliage and fallen branches, as if untouched by time. A trail lay before me, sending a chill down my spine. I knew I wasn't mistaken. I had followed a path, and it was all too real. I paused for a moment, seeking to regain my perspective. The rustling of leaves grew more pronounced, drawing nearer. I paused, taking in my surroundings. There was nothing to be seen. Yet, I was acutely aware that I wasn't solitary. I sensed it, a presence lurking in the trees just beyond my reach. I didn't hesitate to understand what my sight revealed. I activated my energy, found my balance, and began to stride purposefully toward what I believed was the main trail. With each few steps I took, I cast a wary glance over my shoulder. Though my eyes found nothing, the unsettling sound of movement lingered, shadowing my every pause. Every time I took a step forward, the sound ceased. I sensed it once more. It mirrored my actions, yet it was no mere echo. There was a presence mimicking my every move. Accelerate. El Paso. The trees thickened around me. The light faded, shadows stretched out, and my legs propelled me forward, almost without my awareness. I sprinted forward, uncertainty clouding my destination. I ran, driven by an instinct deep within me, aware that if I paused, whatever lurked behind would inevitably close the gap after what felt like an eternity. I tripped and hit the ground, struggling to catch my breath. Additionally, I turned right away. I stood in anticipation, hoping for something to break free from the trees, yet silence lingered in the air. The forest enveloped itself in a profound silence. I sat on the ground, my heart racing in my ears. At last, after a brief pause, I rose to my feet. Then I realized it wasn't just a trail. It was an old, forgotten cabin waiting to be discovered. The wooden walls, draped in a lush blanket of moss, hinted at a roof on the verge of giving way. The structure stood devoid of windows, with a door slightly ajar, revealing an abyss of darkness within. My initial reaction was to flee in the opposite direction. Every horror film warned that venturing inside was the worst choice imaginable. Yet, an inexplicable force pulled me toward it, perhaps the urgency of feeling lost, or the glimmer of hope that someone might be there to assist me. My feet danced with a mind of their own. I reached for the door, and as I pressed it, it creaked open with a soft squeak. The interior was cloaked in a layer of dust, featuring a solitary table. In the heart of the room, a solitary candle dripped wax onto the surface below, but what truly sent a shiver down my spine was the sight before me, a map. A detailed map of the park, with trails boldly marked in red, and right at the center, the unmarked path I had ventured down, the one that defied logic. My heart raced as I instinctively stepped back, only to be startled by the sudden slam of the door behind me, plunging the cabin into utter darkness. I've always envisioned a weekend retreat in a cabin nestled deep in the forest as the ultimate getaway, free from distractions, responsibilities, and filled with tranquility, far removed from the world's chaos. So, when my friend Josh proposed the idea of renting a cabin for the weekend, I jumped at the chance. We discovered a spot that appeared perfect, secluded, enveloped by trees, and adjacent to a serene lake. It felt like the ideal escape. Ideal for achieving mental clarity. We were unprepared for the unsettling feelings that accompanied the cabin. The cabin exuded a timeless rustic charm, spacious enough to comfortably accommodate the four of us. In the afternoon, Josh, his girlfriend Sarah, his friend Emily, and I made our arrival. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we effortlessly unpacked our bags and ignited the fireplace, setting the stage for a delightful first night filled with laughter and engaging conversation. The absence of a signal on our phones amidst the fire only added to the allure. Waking up the next morning after being completely disconnected felt like a breath of fresh air, but I could sense that something had shifted. It was a subtle feeling, a discomfort I couldn't explain. I thought maybe it was from sleeping in a strange place. The creaking of the wood in the early morning sounded louder in the stillness. The air inside the cabin felt heavier. I went to the kitchen to make coffee and looked out the window. I expected to see the light filtering through the trees, but all I saw was fog, a thick fog low, snaking through the trunks, as if it had been there for centuries. It was so dense that I could barely make out the nearest trees. I shuddered a little in that fog. I didn't like it, and I couldn't explain why the cabin itself was old. But it had its RU. It was big enough for the four of us. Josh, his girlfriend Sarah, his friend Emily, and I. The place had a large stone fireplace, wooden beams on the ceiling, and huge windows that looked out onto a thick forest. We arrived in the afternoon with plenty of time to unpack and light a campfire before nightfall. The first night went smoothly. We sat around the fire talking and laughing as the shadows lengthened outside from the cabin. We had no cell phone signal, which was part of the appeal. Waking up the next morning, I felt a shift. The liberating disconnect from the outside world had morphed into an inexplicable discomfort. It was subtle at first, a nagging sensation that lingered just beneath the surface. I initially believed it was merely the sensation of resting in an unfamiliar environment. The cabin's creaks echoed more prominently in the room. The morning was enveloped in stillness, the air inside heavy with anticipation. I rose and made my way to the kitchen to brew some coffee, the cabin cloaked in darkness despite the daylight outside. Peering through the window, I hoped to catch the sun's rays filtering through the trees, but was met instead with a thick, low fog, winding its way between the logs as if it had been there for ages. It was so dense that visibility was nearly lost. Soon after, rubbing his eyes and lamenting the poor signal, we exchanged a few trivial remarks until Sarah and Emily joined us. We shared breakfast, light-heartedly joked about the fog, and made plans to spend the day by the lake once it cleared. Yet by noon, the fog not only lingered but seemed to deepen, wrapping us in its mysterious embrace. The air outside carried an unexpected chill for the season, and despite our efforts to brush it off, the fog hung heavily around us. It was the sort of fog that swallowed sound, rendering the forest hauntingly silent. "How about we go for a walk?" Emily proposed. "As we gaze out the window, there's a chance we might spot some trails that are bound to clear up shortly." I paused, not out of reluctance to attend, but due to an obstacle that stood in my path. The fog that made me uncomfortable. I felt that we should not go out as if the forest was waiting for us to take that first step outside, but Josh and Sarah agreed, and I didn't want to be the only one to back down. So we jacketed and went out the door. The fog enveloped us almost immediately. The forest around the cabin was dense with tall trees, and together their branches intertwined above us. The path we followed was narrow enough for two people to walk side by side. The farther we went, the more the cabin behind us faded away until it was completely hidden by the fog. We walked for a while or so. We thought time was hard to measure in there. The fog muffles all sound, our footsteps, the rustling of the leaves, even our voices seemed muffled. And then I began to notice something strange. The path we were following didn't seem to take us nowhere. It just kept spinning through the trees, but with no visible changes. Each tree looked the same as the last. There was no sign of animals or other trails, nothing, just endless trees and fog. We shouldn't have made it to the lake, I asked, breaking the silence. Josh shrugged. We can go on a little more, sure, we're close. But we weren't. We kept walking, and the discomfort in my stomach turned into a knot of anxiety. It was as if the one who was subtly changing around us. The path felt cyclical. Each turn looked like the last. It was like we were walking in circle, without even realizing it. I think we should go back, Emily said quietly. For the first time we all agreed. But when we turned to go back, the path had disappeared. Where is the path? Rose era spinning in circles. My stomach sank. The path we had followed all this time was no longer there. It was as if the fog had completely erased it. No trace, nothing. We remained silent, none of us wanting to admit what that meant. I could see the fear in his eyes, even in Josh, who was normally carefree. Let's keep it, he said. Although his voice trembled a little, the cabin can't be that far away. We started walking in what we thought was the right direction. But the woods felt closer. The trees seemed closer together. The fog thicker, and then we heard the sound. At first it was soft, barely noticeable, a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. We stopped in dry. What is that? He asked, his voice trembling. No one answered. The sound continued. Tap, tap came from somewhere in the fog further down in the woods. Josh's flashlight lit up the trees, but it didn't reveal anything beyond the thick fog. Tap, louder, now closer. I didn't wait to find out what was causing it. Run, I whispered. We didn't need any further directions. We turned, and we started running through the woods, the fog closing in around us, the branches scratching our skin, the uneven ground making it difficult for us to step. But we didn't stop. Tap. The sound was always following behind us. Then suddenly the fog dissipated, and there in front of us we saw a cabin. But it wasn't ours. The roof was sunken, the wood rotten, the windows broken, the door wide open, rustling in the wind. We stood still, panting. None of us said a word. We didn't need to. We turned and ran in the other direction. The fog began to fade, and finally we saw our cabin. We rushed inside, closed the door, and stood silently listening to nothing. But we knew something. There was something we didn't want to see. That night we packed up and left. We never talked about what happened. But so every time I see thick fog in the woods, I remember that tap, tap, tap sound, and I know there's something out there waiting. I never liked taking the night train. There was something unsettling about the way the world looked out the window, the landscape slipping in a blurry tangle of shadows as the train moved relentlessly through the darkness. But that night I had no choice. I needed to go home, and the night train was my only alternative. I convinced myself that everything would be okay. It would only be a quiet, mostly empty journey, with nothing out of the ordinary. I couldn't be more wrong. I got on late after a long and tiring day. The station was practically deserted, with only the distant hum of the machines and the echo of solitary footsteps in the distance. As I found my seat and settled in, I noticed how empty I was. The carriages were sparsely populated, with a handful of passengers lost in their own thoughts, each absorbed in a personal journey. That should have relaxed me. But in the meantime it made the silence even more oppressive. The train gently tore off, the familiar vibration beneath my feet. I leaned back, trying to relax, while the constant rattle of the wheels on the rails lulled me slowly. Outside, the world flashed by in flashes of shadows, interrupted only by the occasional dim light of a distant farm or a lonely bluff on the road. I watched it for a while, feeling sleep take hold of me, and then, around midnight, I heard it, a sound that would change everything. At first it was barely perceptible, a soft, repetitive knock, as if someone were lightly knocking on a door. I thought it would come from somewhere else in the car, perhaps from another passenger moving, but as the minutes passed, the knocking it became stronger, more and it wasn't coming from the car. It was coming from the wall, right next to my seat. I turned around slowly, feeling a chill running down my back. The seat next to mine was empty, and the one behind me too. There was only the wall of the train vibrating slightly with the movement on the tracks, but the tapping continued. 3 more beats, 1 pause, 3 more knocks, over and over again, as if something was there. I attempted to justify that perhaps it was just the train's vibrations or something loose within the metal framework. Yet, it persisted. It stayed steady, consistently appearing in clusters of 3. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination, fatigue playing tricks on my mind. Yet, the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing moment. I glanced around, searching for another passenger who might have heard it, someone to reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind. But no one seemed to notice. Some were asleep, others glued to their phones, oblivious to the noise. The tapping continued, tack, 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 sending chills down my spine. I stood up suddenly, stepping into the aisle, hoping that moving away from my seat would silence it. And just like that, the noise vanished, replaced by an almost deafening silence. I paused, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything, but all I could hear was the gentle hum of the train gliding forward. I took a deep breath, attempting to steady myself. Perhaps it was merely a figment of my imagination, or perhaps fatigue had clouded my senses. I cast a sideways glance at my seat, anticipating the sound to return, yet all remained serene. I chose to take a stroll to clear my thoughts, weaving between the cars and observing their unsettling emptiness. As I ventured deeper, the familiar sounds of the train began to fade. The distant hum of conversations dwindled, leaving behind only the steady rumble of the trains, rolling smoothly along the tracks. As I approached the next car, anticipation filled me, only to be met with an eerie emptiness. The seats flickered ominously, and the atmosphere felt deserted. A shiver coursed through me, signaling that something was amiss, yet I pressed on, undeterred. The following car was just as empty. The sense that I didn't belong grew more intense, yet an unseen force urged me to press on. Then I heard the deliberate slow footsteps coming from the next car. I hurried, hoping to find someone. I pushed the door open and went inside, but the car was empty. The footsteps had stopped. I felt my skin crawl. I took a step back, ready to turn around and go back to my seat, and then the lights flashed once, twice, and then went out completely. I was left in absolute darkness, with only the sound of the train moving, and then a soft voice, at first almost a whisper, but too close, right behind me. "Why are you here?" My heart stopped. I spun, my breath caught in my throat, but there was no one, just the blackness of the car. The air became heavy, oppressive, the lights flickered again, and for a split second I saw something in the reflections of the windows, a tall figure standing at the back of the car looking at me. The lights went out. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned around and ran, went through the cars as fast as I could, my heart hammering into my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I got to my seat. I dropped into it, trying to catch my breath. The train kept moving as if nothing had happened. The passengers were still in their own worlds, but I knew what I had seen and what I had listened. I stayed in my seat for the rest of the trip with my eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the train to arrive at my destination. When it finally stopped at the station, the air outside felt different, lighter, more confident. I got off without looking back, but even now, sometimes in the stillness of the night, when all is quiet, I can still hear it tick, banging, waiting. And I've never taken the night train. I always thought I was alone when I went for a walk at night. The silent streets, the empty sidewalks, the soft hum of distant traffic, all that made me feel like the world had shut down at night, leaving me in my own bubble of loneliness, that kind of silence that is peaceful, almost comforting. But that night, when I turned down a street I hadn't walked before, that feeling of comfort quickly disappeared, replaced for something I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't planning to go far, just a little tour of the neighborhood to clear my mind. It was late, probably close to midnight, and the air was crisp, cold enough to remind me that autumn was coming. I liked to walk at night, because of the stillness, because of the way the world seemed to hold its breath while waiting for dawn to come. There were no distractions or noises, just the rhythmic sound of my footsteps on the pavement and the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. The street lights flickered softly as I walked, casting long shadows on the ground around me. The houses were dark, with the windows closed and their inhabitants fast asleep. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happened. Really quiet, suburban, predictable. But that night something felt different. As I walked, I noticed a narrow street that I hadn't taken before. It was hidden between two houses, almost invisible, without a lantern to illuminate it. The trees on the sidewalk seemed to lean inward, with their branches forming an arc that led to darkness. I hesitated for a moment, looking down at the street, a stranger curiosity pulling me. I told myself it was just another street like all the others I'd walked before, but there was something about it that felt weird. The air was heavier, denser, as if darkness itself was pressing down on the pavement. I should have turned around and followed my usual route, but instead I stepped forward, my feet carrying me down the unlit path. Before I could stop, the farther I went, the quieter everything became. As the distant hum of traffic faded away, I was left with the sound of my own breathing and the gentle rustle of my shoes against the gravel. The street was flanked by tall, old houses, their dark, empty windows devoid of light, movement, or any sign of life. An unsettling feeling crept in, as if the houses themselves were watching me from the shadows. I continued walking, quickening my pace, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the street was stretching longer than I anticipated, twisting and turning in ways that felt wrong. I had always prided myself on my sense of direction. I knew this neighborhood well. Yet, this street seemed out of place, as if it had materialized just for me. It was then that I first heard it, a faint sound, a whisper carried by the wind, a soft, rhythmic tapping as if someone was beckoning from the wood. I paused, straining to listen, but the sound seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I looked around, but the street was empty. There was no one there. I told myself it was probably just a loose shutter or an old metal door swinging in the breeze. Nothing to worry about. But when I started to walk again, the pounding grew louder. It was constant, deliberate, as if someone was following my rhythm. Hot on my heels, I stopped again, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, waiting to see someone hiding in the shadows, but the street behind me was empty, only the dark and silent houses and the narrow path stretching out in the night. The pounding stopped with me. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of my own breathing, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started walking again, this time faster. The tapping came back louder, now more insistent. My heart raced as I increased my step, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The sound of me, it went on, never too far, always just out of my sight. I broke into a race, my breath coming out in short, frantic puffs. The houses around me seemed to merge into one, their dark, lifeless windows. I didn't know any more where I was going. I just knew I needed to get away from what was following me. The street was turning and twisting. The houses grew taller and warped in the dim light. I felt like I was running in the dim light. Circles as if the street folded in on itself, catching it slightly tilted to the side. My stomach sank. Every instinct in my body yelled at me to turn around, to run in the opposite direction, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my feet anchored to the ground. As I stared at the figure, it didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there waiting. The pounding started again, louder, this time like if it was right next to me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there, just the empty street. Behind me, stretching out in the darkness, I looked back to where the figure was. It had disappeared. The sidewalk was empty, the houses dark and silent. Once more, I didn't wait to see if I would come back. I turned around and ran with all my might down the street, my breath rushing in my chest. The pounding kept ringing out of me in the night, faster and faster, as if it was chasing me. I didn't stop until I saw the familiar glow of a lamppost ahead, the main road. Security. I ran off the dark street and reached the main road with my heart pounding in my ribs and my legs shaking. The tapping stopped the instant I stepped on the light. I looked back, but the street behind I was empty. The narrow path I had followed seemed to fade into the shadows, as if I had never been there. I stood there for a long time, catching my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation. There was no reason for the fear that still enveloped me. The street had disappeared. The figure was gone, of being followed. It remained floating like a shadow in the depths of my life. Since then, I haven't taken a stroll at night. There's something undeniably serene about cruising solo on a deserted road at night. The gentle purr of the engine, the shadows wrapping around the car, and the open lanes ahead create the perfect backdrop for a moment of reflection. Yet, on that night, as I navigated the lonely stretch of highway, the tranquility I once cherished in solitude swiftly morphed into a sense of dread. It all began with the lights. The front lines behind me seemed innocuous at first. A car approaching from behind wasn't unusual, even on a desolate road like this. Yet, something about those headlights in my rearview mirror stirred a sense of unease. They were too distant to identify the vehicle, just two bright spots lingering in the dark. Instead of fading, they remained fixed behind me, matching my speed. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 2:01 a.m. The road had been barren for miles. No towns, no gas stations, not a single car in sight until now. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, attempting to dismiss the creeping discomfort. Surely, it was just another night driver, navigating the long stretch of highway like I was. But as the minutes ticked by, those headlights neither drew closer nor receded. They stayed there, following me as if I was too comfortable with the distance. After several minutes of this, I decided I was getting paranoid. Maybe they were just driving cautiously, not wanting to get too close. In the middle of the night it made sense, right? But the feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. I took a look at the speedometer, 65 miles per hour, a pretty standard speed for that road. I assumed it would speed up a bit. Either they would stay behind, or they would catch up with me, and maybe overtake me to continue on their way. Press the accelerator, increasing the speed to 70, then to 75. For a brief moment I thought I was free, but then the headlights behind me also accelerated. They kept keeping the same distance, not getting any closer but equalizing exactly. My speed was at that moment when I knew something wasn't right. My heart started beating faster and my mind was filled with questions. Who was this person? Why were they following me? And why wasn't they overtaking me? I scanned the road ahead looking for an exit or a rest area, something that would give me a choice to get out of this situation. But there was nothing, just more road stretching endlessly in the darkness. A shiver it ran down my back and I could feel the panic taking over me. I didn't want to stop, I didn't want to pull myself up, but I also didn't want to be stuck on this empty highway with someone following me at 2 in the morning. I had no idea what their intentions were, but I wasn't willing to find out. I pressed harder on the accelerator, bringing the car to 80. This time I was waiting for the other driver to back up, perhaps realizing that I wasn't interested in what weird game they were playing. But the headlights stayed right where they were, keeping the same unsettling distance behind me. I had enough of the hints. If they were determined to chase me, they better be ready for a challenge. I pressed the accelerator, and my car surged forward, roaring past 90 miles per hour. The road became a blur, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the thrill of possibly escaping them. But then, as if out of choreography, the headlights also accelerated, always keeping the same distance, always there. My pulse was beating hard, now panic squeezing my chest. This was not normal. It was not a simple coincidence. They were following me on purpose. But why did I try to think of my options? There was no exit nearby. There were no places to stop. I could try to call someone. But in this place I had no signal. I looked at my phone, confirming what I already knew, not a single bar was completely alone. Despair began to settle in my mind, going through all the possible scenarios, and if I just stopped, they would also stop, get out of their car and get closer to me. My thoughts sank into the worst possible scenarios, each one scarier than the last, and then the car behind me did something I didn't expect. Without warning, the headlights disappeared. The second they were there, dazzling in my rearview mirror, and the next they were gone just like that. Blinking, slowing down a little, my eyes scanning the road behind me. The highway stretched out in the empty darkness. There was no car. There were no lights. Nothing. For a moment I thought I had imagined it all. Maybe I was so scared that my mind had played tricks on me. But I had seen them had followed by miles, and now they had just disappeared. Throttle, letting the car slow down to a reasonable speed. Even though my heart was still pounding in my chest, they would have swerved. Maybe they had finally tired of the game and taken an exit that I didn't notice, but that didn't explain how they disappeared. So suddenly I kept driving, trying to calm down. I told myself that it had already happened, that I was safe. I looked at the clock again, 2:30 in the morning. I just needed to get to the end of this stretch of road. I repeated to myself that it was all over, that I was already free of danger. But I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was still wrong, and then I saw them. The headlights appeared. Again, this time much closer, right on my bumper. My breath stopped in my throat, and I could feel my hands shaking as I squeezed the steering wheel. How they had approached so fast made no sense. I hadn't seen them for miles, and now they were practically on top of me. I swerved slightly, trying to put some distance between us, but the car behind me matched my every move. They were right there, almost glued to my bumper, their lights when my mirrors. My mind was panicking, my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Suddenly the car behind me accelerated even closer, getting so close that I thought they were going to hit me. My heart jumped to my throat as I turned the steering wheel, avoiding a collision. The headlights were dazzling, now so bright that it overshadowed everything around me. And then, as fast as they had disappeared, they did again. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly while I looked around in desperation, looking for any trace of that car. Nothing. The headlights were gone, there was no car, no sound, nothing. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and my chest was squeezed with fear. What was going on? How could a car disappear like this twice? How could a car disappear like this, twice? I stood still for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make some sense of what I was doing. It had just occurred, yet no explanation seemed to fit. I wasn't willing to stick around to find out if the headlights would return for a third time. I pressed the accelerator and sped down the highway, glancing at the mirrors every few seconds, wishing to catch a glimpse of those lights, but they never showed up. The road lay desolate, extending into the darkness as though time itself had paused. Upon arriving at a quaint gas station nestled along the highway's edge, I came to a halt. As I switched off the engine, my hands trembled uncontrollably. I lingered in that moment, heart racing, replaying the events I had just experienced in my mind again and again. Even now, the mystery of what I discovered on that road lingers in my mind. Perhaps it was a clever ruse, a darkly humorous prank from someone with an abundance of free time. Or maybe it was something else, something I can't explain, but of one thing I'm sure: I've never driven on that road at night again. It wasn't like me to ignore the signs, those little warnings, that feeling in my stomach that tells you something's not right. But when I agreed to take care of my cousin's house for the weekend, I ignored that instinct. I told myself it was just a weekend, a favor to the family. Her home, it was Bidgie's, and it was in the middle of nowhere, but it wasn't like I'd never been alone in a strange place before. Yet from the moment I arrived something felt off. Maybe it was the way the forest closed in around the property, or the way the air seemed thicker there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as lonely as I thought I was. It was one of those old Victorian mansions, the kind of place that seemed to have stories buried in its walls. My cousin Julie had inherited it from a distant relative a few months earlier and had spent most of the time renovating them, which told me something like it's so quiet, you can almost hear the house breathing at the time. I thought I was just being poetic. I arrived late in the afternoon with the sun already starting to descend behind the line of trees surrounding the property, shadows lengthening over the lawn, making the house seem even more isolated than it really was. As soon as I got out of the car, the weight of silence hit me. There were no birds, no wind moving the leaves, just absolute stillness. I shook the feeling, telling myself that it was normal. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. What else? Julie had left the key under the mat along with a note stuck on the door. Thanks for doing this. If you hear strange noises, don't worry. The house is old and creaks a lot. See you on Monday. That last line stuck in my mind as I turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open, tried to laugh about it. Houses like these always creaked, right? It was just wood settling down. I had been to enough old places to know, but as I walked in, the feeling that something wasn't right didn't go away. The inside was just as imposing as the outside. Tall ceilings, long hallways, lots of dark wood and antique furniture that seemed to have been there for decades. The tall windows barely let in enough light, and the air had that faint smell of dust and old books. I left my bag at the foot of the room. I ascended the stairs and started to explore the house, familiarizing myself with its layout. I moved quickly, even though it was still early. The forest outside was already shrouded in a deepening darkness. As the evening unfolded, I chose to unwind by whipping up a quick dinner, then nestled into the living room with a good book for some quality time. The atmosphere was serene. The house embraced a tranquil silence. The gentle crackle of the fire in the fireplace created a soothing backdrop, and the comforting heaviness of sleep started to envelop my eyelids. I heard a soft, distant crack coming from upstairs. I froze with the book halfway up my lap. I listened, holding my breath, telling me it was just the house as Julie had said. But then came another, louder sound, this time a long, slow creak as if someone was walking down the hallway on the second floor. I stood up with my heart pounding. I took the flashlight from the coffee table and I went up the stairs cautiously. The corridor stretched dark and silent. Before me I stood still, waiting, but the house had fallen silent again. Only my breathing and the slight creak of the curtains moving in the breeze. I checked every room starting with mine. Nothing. My bag was still in place, the sheets intact. The other two rooms were the same, doors ajar, stagnant air. Nothing out of place. The bathroom at the end of the hall was just as empty. I forced myself to laugh, telling myself that it had been my imagination. The houses creak, especially the old ones. I was probably letting my nerves play Tricks on me. I went back downstairs determined to sleep and forget the matter. But as soon as I set foot in the living room I heard it again. This time, there was no doubt, slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming straight from the second floor, right on where I was standing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I stared at the ceiling. Someone was walking upstairs, but I had just checked. There was no one there. I tried to find a logical explanation. Perhaps an animal in the attic. Or some structural problem that made the house sound like someone was walking. But deep down I knew that none of those answers made sense. I stood there for a long time listening as the footsteps continued, each one measured unhurriedly, as if whatever was upstairs knew I was listening. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I snorted my phone, hoping to find signal. Nothing, of course. Not. The house was too far from town with few options. I took my things and decided to leave. I didn't care if Julie thought I was exaggerating. Something wasn't right in that house, and I wasn't going to find out what it was. But just as I was about to walk out the door, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. I stood there paralyzed on the threshold waiting, but nothing happened. The forest outside was still quiet. The house was still. For a moment I considered staying, telling myself that it had all been my imagination, but then I heard it, a soft voice, almost a whisper. V from upstairs, come back. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran out, closing the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode as I ran to my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away down the dirt road. When I finally told Julie what had happened, she laughed. She said the house was old, that it sure needed more repairs. But no, I've come back. Something in that house wasn't right, and whatever it was that I was walking down the hall that night is something I never want to know. If you ever have a bad feeling about a place, trust it. 'Cause sometimes silence isn't peace, it's a warning. I don't know what it is about strange noises in the middle of the night that make your heart race. Maybe it's because your brain it's already halfway between dreams and reality, or maybe it's because the darkness makes everything feel a little more dangerous. Whatever the reason. When I heard the knocking on the door that night I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially at 3 in the morning, and here in the middle of nowhere. No one should have even been able to find me. I had rented the little cabin on the weekend, looking to get away from the constant noise and stress of city life. I was deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. No cell phone signal, no internet, just peace and quiet. It sounded perfect, the kind of place where you could get lost for a few days and come back to reality feeling refreshed. The first day had been exactly like that. I spent most of my time walking through the streets, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the sound of leaves crunching under my boots. By the time the sun went down I was pleasantly exhausted. I lit a campfire, cooked a simple meal, and I spent the night reading a book in the dim light of a flashlight. When I finally got into bed, the silence of the forest enveloped me like a blanket. No cars, no people, just the soft rustle of the trees outside. But now, in the middle of the night, that same silence felt oppressive. I sat on the bed with my heart beating in my chest while I listened to the knocks. They sounded soft again, but deliberate, as if someone was knocking carefully on the front door. Agus, his ear trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was the wind, a branch brushing the cabin. But the sound was too rhythmic to make the wind. Definitely someone was knocking. I looked at the clock on the bedside table. 3:1 in the morning. My mind raced. Who could be there at this hour? I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. There were other cabins nearby, and the road that led there was a long, winding dirt road that most people wouldn't run, especially in the middle of the night. The banging sounded a little louder again, this time as if whoever was outside was losing patience. My stomach twisted uneasily and slipped. There was no peephole in the door, and all the windows were closed with thick curtains blocking the door. Seeing the porch for a moment, I stood there motionless in the darkness, debating whether I should answer. Maybe it was someone in trouble, someone who had gotten lost and needed help. But that made no sense. Who would be wandering so far into the forest at this hour? I took the flashlight from the bedside table and walked slowly towards the door with my Mara heart in my ribs. With each step, the knocks stopped as soon as I approached, leaving the cabin in total silence. I hesitated again with my hand on the knob, every instinct in my body telling me not to open it. But then I heard it, a faint voice, barely more than a whisper, coming from the other side of the door. "Hello," softly called the voice. "There's someone there." It sounded faint, as if the speaker had been walking for hours, exhausted and without strength. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my runaway heart. Maybe after all, if they needed help, maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. With trembling fingers, I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack long enough to take a look outside. The porch was empty, my breath getting stuck in my throat as I scanned the shadows beyond the dim porch light, the trees towering tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the wind, but there was no one there, no sign of anyone, just the stillness of the forest and the cold air seeping into the cabin. I stepped back, feeling a chill run down my spine. I had imagined it. The knocks, the voice had been some strange, half-sleep, the result of tiredness. I began to close the door, but before I could do it the voice sounded again. "Please," whispered closer, "this time let me in." I froze with my hand clutching the knob, the voice coming from the darkness, right beyond the porch, too close to be comfortable. I leaned forward slightly, trying to see in the gloom, but there was nothing there, nothing at all, just that low, pleading voice as if it were right next to me. "Please," she said again, this time in a more insistent tone. I slammed the door, my heart galloping in my chest. The eye started backing away, my mind turning in 1,000 directions. The knocks, the voice, none of this made sense. There was no one outside. I was sure of it. I stood there for a moment, listening, with gasping breath. The cabin sank back into silence, only interrupted by the occasional creak of the old wooden walls. I backed up to the bedroom, closing the door behind me and assuring them terrifyingly that the previous and then from the other side of the bedroom door I heard him again. "Please," whispered the soft and insistent voice. "Let me in." My blood froze. The voice was inside the cabin now, just across the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode as I backed away, sticking to the opposite wall, my eyes riveted on the door, waiting for it to slam open. But it didn't. The voice spoke quieter again, now almost a moan. "Let me in." I wanted to scream, do something, anything, but I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Fear had me paralyzed. How I had entered. What was I? I waited. Every second felt like an eternity. But the voice didn't speak again. The cabin was silent again. Just the sound of my own breathing and the deafening beat in my ears. I didn't sleep. No, I moved alone. Froze there in the same place, hoping that whatever was in the cabin would make its next move. But nothing happened. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I felt like I could breathe again. I waited a few more minutes, listening for any sign of music. But the cabin remained silent. The voice, whatever it was gone. I left there as soon as possible. As quickly as I could. I left and haven't returned since. If you ever hear a knock on your door in the dead of night, resist the urge to open it. Sometimes, what awaits you on the other side is something you'd never want to let in. I used to dismiss the supernatural ghosts, spirits, those fleeting shadows of the night as mere tales for campfires or horror flicks. That all changed the night I stayed in the cabin. What I encountered there transcended mere imagination. No matter how hard I try to rationalize it, I can't shake the unsettling feeling that I stumbled upon something I was never meant to see, something undeniably real. The cabin belonged to my uncle, a family relic for years, yet few seemed keen to spend time there. They claimed it was too isolated, that the woods held an odd energy. I never paid their warnings any mind. For me, those remarks were merely about a rustic cabin tucked away in the wilderness, an ideal sanctuary to unwind from work pressures and recharge for the weekend. When my uncle presented the opportunity, I jumped at the chance without a second thought. Late autumn enveloped the scene, with a crisp chill signaling winter's approach. The trees stood nearly bare, their branches twisting into dark, intricate silhouettes against the sky as I drove through the landscape. The narrow road that led to the cabin, the place was more deteriorated than I remembered. The roof was sunken in places, the windows cracked, the wood covered with moss, but I didn't care. It was just what I was looking for, a shelter away from everything. When I arrived, the sun was already setting, painting the sky orange tones. I took my bag, locked the car, and walked to the entrance. The key turned with a rusty click, and the door opened with a long, heavy squeak. The inside smelled musty and dusty, as if no one had been there in months. The main living room was simple: a couple of old chairs, a coffee table, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. I left my things on the couch and started lighting the fire. Soon the flames crackled and the heat began to fill the room. I settled into one of the chairs with a book in hand, letting the warmth relax me outside. The wind blew through the trees, and from time to time the cabin creaked with the movement of the wood. But it was normal. It was cozy until I heard the first knock. At first I thought it was just the wind. but it didn't sound like the rustling of the branches against the wall. It was something more than 3 deliberate slow knocks on the door. I froze, my heart beating faster. I listened carefully only to the sound of fire and wind. I just shook my head and let out a nervous laugh. Sure, it was just the cabin settling down. I got up to go to the kitchen and pour myself a glass of water. The kitchen was small, with old appliances and a single window overlooking the woods. While I drank, I looked out of the room window, and then I saw her, a tall and thin figure standing right at the edge of the trees. I couldn't see details, only her silhouette motionless looking at me. My heart stopped blinking. When I looked again, it wasn't. The forest was empty. The uneasiness settled in my chest. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my mind was playing with me. Yes, sure it was that I went back to the room trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The fireplace was still burning, but the cabin felt colder. I took a blanket and wrapped myself in it, determined to ignore the incident. And then again, 3 knocks. My blood froze. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the cabin creaking. Was someone or something standing in the doorway. I stood up slowly. I didn't want to open everything in my body. I was telling myself not to, but curiosity, always curiosity. I advanced towards the door, each step harder than the last. I took the handle, hesitated for a second, and opened it. Nothing. The porch was empty, only the wind whistling among the bare trees. I went down a step and looked around. No footprints in the damp earth, no sign that anyone had been there. The knot in my stomach tightened. I was about to go back inside when I noticed a just movement beyond the tree line. There was the closest figure, this time standing motionless in the gloom of the forest. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its gaze. My skin bristled. I slowly backed away towards the door, not looking away, but just as I was about to close, the figure moved, didn't walk, didn't run, just disappeared. The air stopped feeling cold. Now I was slamming the door shut and ran to lock the lock. The fire was still burning in the fireplace, but it didn't make me feel safe anymore. I sat in the chair wrapped in the blanket, staring at the door, waiting, but the knocks didn't come back, not even the sound of the wind, just the silence. A silence so heavy that it made me feel that something, whatever was outside, was waiting too. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My body was tense. My mind was tense, on alert, with my eyes fixed on the window, waiting to see that figure. When the sun started to filter through the trees, I had everything packed. I wouldn't stay a minute longer. I threw my backpack into the back seat of the car, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could. My uncle never wanted him to think I was crazy, but I didn't go back to the cabin either. I don't plan to do whatever it was in the woods that night. It wasn't just a shadow, it wasn't my imagination. It was something else, and I still have the feeling that it's not done with me. You know that feeling when you have been to a road that you've been on hundreds of times, but suddenly everything feels different. The trees seem taller, the road gets narrower, and the sky seems to press down on you in a way that makes you uncomfortable. That's exactly what happened to me that night, and it was the first sign that something was wrong. It was as if the world had changed slightly enough to make me question if I was really in the same place. I had just left a friend's house after a late dinner and decided to take the scenic route back home. The country road stretched before me, familiar and inviting, an ancient path winding through the lush Pacific forests, typically deserted during this hour. During the night, I cherished the solitude of the journey, the way the trees arched overhead like a protective tunnel, and the soothing sound of gravel crunching beneath my tires. That night, however, felt distinct. It was just past 11 p.m. 11 p.m., 11 p.m., 11 p.m., and the road was darker than I remembered. The headlights of my car seemed weaker, barely illuminating a few meters ahead, and the trees on both sides of the road, they felt closer than usual. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and without its light, the darkness outside the car became heavy, almost oppressive. As I went deeper into the woods, I began to notice something strange. The road that normally had a few wooden houses scattered along the way was completely empty. There were no houses, no mailboxes, no signs of life, only trees stretching endlessly to both sides. I didn't realize it right away, but at some point I understood that no other car had passed in over 30 minutes. Normally, even at that time, I saw at least 1 or 2 cars. The discomfort began to settle in me, so I turned on the radio to break the silence. This Costa Rica. I moved the dial looking for a station, but I didn't find anything. It was then, when I looked at my phone resting on the passenger seat, and I saw that it had no signal, and just at that moment the road healed. I didn't expect it. I knew this road, it was an endless straight for miles before a smooth curve, but this curve was closed, almost unnatural. My heart skipped a beat as I turned the steering wheel, the headlights illuminating more of that narrow and unknown road. My knuckles tensed on the steering wheel as it was possible that there never had been. As I approached the curve, a sense of unease washed over me, prompting me to decelerate. It felt as though I had unwittingly veered off course, yet I quickly dismissed the thought. This road was devoid of intersections, offering nothing but a direct path through the dense forest until I emerged in the quaint town beyond. As I navigated the curve, my eyes caught sight of something ahead, faint lights shimmering like the soft glow of a street lamp illuminating the road. Exhaled distance, maybe there was a small town or a house ahead, something to remind me that I wasn't completely alone in the middle of nowhere. But as I got closer I realized that the lights weren't lanterns, they were flickering like candles. They came from inside a small, dilapidated building on the side of the road. It was a gas station, or so it seemed. But it was old, very old. The kind of place that seemed to have not been in operation for decades. The sign outside was rusty, the windows were dark, and the pumps looked like I haven't seen a drop of gasoline in years. But most disturbing of all, the lights inside the station were on soft and flickering lights like candles or oil lamps. I slowed down as I walked past the hairs on the back of my neck. I wondered who would be there in the middle of the night lighting candles at an abandoned gas station. I looked around looking for signs of movement, but the road was empty and the forest full of shadows. I didn't stop, I kept driving, but the further I went the more uneasy I felt. It made no sense that gas station didn't exist on that road. I had never seen it, but there it was, as clear as the day. I accelerated a little, wanting to put distance between me and that place, but the more I drove the more I was starting to realize that something was very, very wrong. The road didn't feel familiar anymore. The trees, the curve, the gas station, nothing made sense. It was like somehow I had ended up on a road that didn't exist on any map. My heart was pounding when I checked my phone again, expecting to see at least one signal bar, blank screen, and then I saw it again. The gas station was the same rusty sign, the same flashing lights. It was right next to the road, as if it had been waiting for me. I slammed on the brakes, my breathing quickening. It couldn't be. I hadn't turned around. There was no Tom, no wrong detour, and yet there I was. Somehow, I had come back to the same place. I stood motionless for a long moment, my hands clenching the steering wheel and my mind trying to make sense of it. As I was passing by, the headlights of my car illuminated the old petrol pumps, casting long shadows on the gravel. The flickering lights inside the station seemed to dance in the windows, casting haunting shadows on the walls. I didn't want to stop, but something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe fear, made me put the car in park and get out. The air outside was colder than I expected, and the silence was deafening. All I could hear was the crunch of gravel under my boots as I approached the gas station, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air as I walked toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. I hesitated for a moment, looking through the dirty windows. The inside was small and messy, the dusty shelves filled with old cans and faded signs. The lights flickered over a series of candles placed haphazardly in the room, casting long, dancing shadows on the floor. And then I saw her. A woman was behind the counter with her back to me. She wasn't moving. Her long hair fell over her shoulders, motionless in the dim light. I couldn't see her face. There was something unsettling about her posture, the way she stood completely still, that made my stomach churn. I knocked on the window, desperate for her attention, but she remained unmoved. I tapped again, this time louder, yet still nothing. She stood there like a statue. Compelled by an unknown force, I reached for the doorknob. A small bell chimed, its sound cutting through the silence. I stepped inside, the musty scent of dust and aged wood filling my lungs. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. Silence enveloped me. She didn't respond or even turn. Then I noticed him. His feet didn't touch the ground, hovering just inches above the floor. My body went rigid as my mind raced to find a logical explanation for the impossible sight before me. But there was none. She remained there, motionless, her hair cascading over her shoulders, her body suspended in the air. The doorbell chimed again behind her. The door had opened by itself. I didn't wait to see what would happen. Then I turned immediately and ran out of the gas station, tripping over the gravel. When I got to my car, my hands were shaking as I tried to put the key in the lock, and when I finally managed to start the engine, I stepped on the accelerator without looking back. The road passed in a blur of darkness and flashing lights. I didn't slow down until I saw the first signs of the village in the distance, the street lights, illuminating the road with comforting warmth. Only then did I dare to breathe normally. When I got home, I sat in the car for a long time with my hands still clutching the steering wheel. I had no idea what I had seen that night. I didn't know how I had ended up on that road or why the same gas station had appeared twice. But yes, I knew one thing. I'd never take that route again, and if you ever find yourself driving down a road that feels too empty, too dark, I suggest you do the same. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. There's a kind of place where time seems to have stopped, places where everything feels frozen, intact, like the world had never touched them. That's how I felt the moment I put a foot in that abandoned hotel. Wasn't supposed to be there, but curiosity got the better of me. Now looking back, I wish I'd ignored that need to explore, because once I walked in it was clear that something about that place wasn't right. Something I can't explain, but I'll never forget. It all started when my friend Jake told me about the one we were in the middle of a road trip, just the two of us heading to a small town where we were to meet some friends for a camping weekend. We stopped at a roadside restaurant for dinner, and it was there that Jake heard about the hotel for the first time. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with deep dark circles under her eyes, mentioned the place matter-of-factly as she refilled our drinks. She said it had been abandoned for decades by a lake on the outskirts of town. According to her, in the 1920s it had been a popular tourist destination until something happened. Something no one talked about since. The hotel was forgotten, letting time consume it. Jake always. The adventurer's excitement was palpable as he urged us to visit the hotel, a smile lighting up his face. I, however, felt a twinge of hesitation. The waitress had spoken of the place in hushed tones, hinting at secrets best left untouched. Yet, Jake was relentless. "Come on, it'll be fun," he insisted. "We have time before camp, and who knows what we might discover?" I should have listened to my instincts, but I merely shrugged and went along with it. After all, it was just an old building. What could possibly go wrong? We arrived at the hotel just as the sun dipped below the horizon, navigating a narrow, winding road flanked by towering trees that loomed ominously on either side. The further we went, the more the sounds of the outside world died away. The bustle of the road disappeared, replaced by the rustle of leaves in the wind. When finally the hotel appeared before us, the first thing I noticed was how still it was. The whole building was huge. It towered over the trees, its facade in ruins, showing the scars of abandonment. The windows were broken and dark, the roof sunk in places. Stones and weeds climbed up its walls, clinging to the once elegant balconies. But what really disturbed me was the lake stretched out behind the hotel, barely visible among the trees. The water was strangely still as a mirror, reflecting the sky, getting darker and darker. There were no ripples or movement. Nothing seemed dead. Something about him felt wrong, as if he was waiting for something. Jake didn't seem to notice it. He had already gotten out of the car and was walking towards the entrance of the hotel with an excited expression on his face. I didn't want to be alone, so I followed him. The doors were unlocked when Jake pushed them open. They opened with a long, heavy creak. The air inside was thick, laden with the smell of dust and rotting wood. The lobby was huge, with a marble staircase in the center and a chandelier hanging from the ceiling. Despite the shards of glass strewn across the floor, the walls stood intact. The furniture, as anticipated in a deserted space, was haphazardly arranged and draped in dusty old sheets. There was an undeniable weight in the air, a palpable tension that suggested the walls were guarding secrets they were reluctant to reveal. As we strolled through the lobby, our footsteps reverberated in the vast emptiness, and Jake, captivated, snapped photos and pointed out doors that beckoned exploration. Yet, I couldn't share his enthusiasm. With each step deeper into the hotel, my unease grew. The air thickened, making it harder to breathe, and every sound seemed to stretch out, echoing as we ascended the grand staircase, the wood creaking ominously beneath us. The hallways above were adorned with aged doors, some barely clinging to their hinges. Jake was eager to delve into the guest rooms, but something inexplicable pulled me toward the end of the corridor. There stood a door, larger than the rest, firmly shut. Compelled by an unseen force, I called Jake, and together we approached it, curiosity igniting within us. The nearer I approached, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. My chest tightened as though an unseen weight was bearing down on me. Jake grasped the handle and turned it, watching as the door creaked open to reveal a magnificent ballroom. The expansive space was adorned with floor-to-ceiling windows, inviting in an abundance of light. Although covered in dirt and dust, a huge chandelier hung from the ceiling, similar to the one in the lobby, but twisted and covered with cobwebs. The floor it was full of broken furniture, chairs, tables, and in one corner an old piano with yellowed keys. But it wasn't the room itself what made us stop with the figures. At first I thought they were statues. 5 figures standing by the windows with their backs to us. They were wearing old clothes like from the 20s. They didn't move. They didn't make noise. They were just there looking towards the lake. Jake muttered an insult and backed away one step. I couldn't move either. My skin stood on end when I realized that these weren't statues. They were people, or at least they had been. Their clothes were worn out and hung loose on their bodies. Their skin was pale, too pale. None of them turned. They just stood there watching the lake, and then one of the figures shook its head. It just turned slowly, as if it was listening to something. I didn't see his face, didn't want to see him. My hand trembled as I grabbed Jake's arm. "We have to go," I whispered. Jake nodded. Just as we were about to make our move, another figure shifted its gaze, followed by another. One by one, they began to focus their attention on us. Their eyes were wide, their mouths agape as if attempting to utter words, yet silence enveloped them. As they advanced towards us, we bolted, racing down the stairs without a single glance behind. With the sound of our footsteps resonating in the vacant lobby, we dashed out of the hotel and leaped into the car. Without uttering a single word, Jake ignited the engine and pressed down on the accelerator. We pressed on, leaving the hotel far in our wake. We never spoke of what we witnessed, neither that night nor in the days that followed. Moreover, one thing is clear: that heat isn't void. Something remains, and whatever it is, it prefers to stay undisturbed. In the heart of the forest, a unique silence envelopes you, a stillness that feels almost sacred. The silence isn't the tranquil, calming kind you might anticipate. Instead, it carries a weight of stillness, an emptiness that suggests the world is pausing, holding its breath. The silence that enveloped me that night was palpable, a heavy weight marking the moment everything unraveled. I ventured into the wilderness solo on numerous occasions, but this particular journey felt distinct right from the start. I discovered my own corner of the universe. Deep in the forest, away from the usual camps, with no one else around for miles. This is how I liked it. Just me, the trees and the stars above me. It was late summer. The days were still warm, but the nights were starting to get cold. I pitched my tent in a small clearing near the edge of a dense pine forest, a perfect place that felt isolated from the rest of the world. No phone signal. No, the first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood, setting up camp, and exploring the trails near dusk. I had a small fire lit and dinner cooking. The smell of smoke mingled with the scent of pine needles in the air. As the sun disappeared into the horizon, the shadows lengthened, and the forest took on a darker, more mysterious air. But it wasn't until the campfire was reduced to incandescent embers that I noticed the silence. At first I didn't think much of it. The forest usually calms down at night, after all. But this silence was different. It was thick, heavy, as if the whole forest had stood still at the same time. There were no rustling leaves, no buzzing insects, no animals in the distance. Nothing was as if the world was my surroundings would have been swallowed by the darkness. I tried to ignore the feeling of uneasiness that crawled down my spine, telling me that it was only loneliness, playing with my mind. I had been alone in the forest many times before, and I had never felt fear before. But this silence made my skin stand on end. I stirred the fire, watching as the embers shone for an instant before extinguishing in a soft glow. The trees around me, their branches seemed to close tighter, casting long shadows that flickered in the light of the flames. I felt something watching me. I shook my head, telling myself that I was being ridiculous. It was just the forest. There was nothing else there. Yet I couldn't help but look over my shoulder more than once, scanning the darkness for something I couldn't name. By the time I got into the tent, the air had cleared. As I zipped up the tent, I felt the restlessness in my stomach intensify, a reminder that sleep was elusive that night. With each blink, an unsettling sensation crept in, as if something lurked just beyond my sight. Hours seemed to stretch on before sleep finally claimed me, only to be abruptly interrupted by the rustling of something stirring outside the store. With my heart pounding in my chest for a moment, I just stood there listening, trying to figure out if I had imagined it. The forest was still silent, too quiet, but then I heard it again. A soft crack as if something was moving in the undergrowth just outside the camp. Grabbed my flashlight. My hands trembled as I struggled with the switch. The ace of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls of the eye. Heard it again. Forcing it down, there was again a slow, deliberate crackling followed by the unmistakable sound of something brushing against the tent canvas. My breathing stopped. It wasn't an animal, or at least not one that I knew. The movement was too controlled, too intentional, as if whatever was there knew exactly what I was doing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves off the zipper of the tent just enough to poke the lantern out. The fire had gone out hours ago. Leaving the camp shrouded in darkness, the ace of light flashed through the trees. But there was no sign of anything or anyone, just the empty forest motionless as always. But I felt it. Something was there alone beyond the reach of the light waiting. I stayed like this for a long time, half outside the tent with the flashlight clutched in my hand, scanning the shadows for the slightest movement. But the sound didn't return. The forest fell silent again, and the feeling of being watched began to fade. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I convinced myself that it had been nothing. Maybe a falling branch or some small animal moving through the bushes. Nothing to worry about. I closed the tent and lay down again. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, every whisper of the wind through the trees made my nerves sore. I lay in the dark wide awake, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next time I opened my eyes it was already morning. The sunlight filtered through the trees and the air had warmed up a bit. Everything looked normal, Pacific, even, and for a moment I felt stupid for having let my imagination run wild. I left the tent stretching as I looked around the camp. Everything was just as the campfire had left it. The cooking equipment, my backpack leaning against a log, but then I saw something that made me stop in seco. Footprints were faint but unmistakable from the edge of the trees to right next to my tent. They were not animal tracks. They were too big, too human. My blood was too human. It froze as I followed its trail with my gaze. The footprints made a single circle around the tent and then disappeared back into the woods, as if someone had walked in circles around my campsite in the middle of the night and then vanished into the trees. I stood there with my mind racing at full speed. Who could have been there? There were no other nearby campsites. No path traveled enough to that someone was hanging around, and if anyone had been there, why had I just stood in silence watching? A feeling of pure terror took over me as I picked up my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I put everything in my backpack. I wasn't going to stay another night in that place, not after knowing that something or someone had been there while I was sleeping. The way back to the car, it was a blur. The trees that seemed peaceful the day before now felt threatening, their shadows stretching like long, dark fingers. Every sound made me jump. Every rustling of leaves made me think. Something was following me. When I finally got to my car, I threw the backpack in the back seat and started the engine with trembling hands, but before I accelerated and drove away, I looked one last time towards the trail, and there was a barely visible figure among the trees, tall, thin, motionless, watching me. I didn't wait to see what I would do. I stepped on the gas and walked away as fast as I could. I haven't been back to that forest since, and every time I think about going camping again, I can't shake the feeling that something deep in the forest keep waiting, keep watching. It's funny how silence can go from being peaceful to terrifying in a matter of seconds. One night at the camp, the sound of the campfire crackling, the leaves rustling in the wind, and the distant murmur of the creek made me feel calm until I stepped out of my mind. In that moment, everything shifted. The atmosphere grew dense, as though the forest itself was pausing in anticipation. The calmness that used to soothe me now left me feeling exposed. I had absolutely no plans to rise from my cozy spot. In the stillness of the night, it was just Lucas, Jake, Sarah, and me. It was an escape from the bustling city of concerns. Lucas discovered the site on a hiker's forum, declaring it ideal, free from tourists and noise. Initially, it felt right, but now, as I stand by the campfire and watch the flames flicker, I can't help but feel a wave of regret for having come here. The silence of the forest was unsettling. It was the source of my true concern. You might not fully grasp just how loud it truly was. Which is nature until everything is completely silent. No insects, no birds, nothing. Then I saw them, the footprints. Lucas had mentioned seeing some before, but we had ignored them. Maybe another camper had passed through here before, but now seeing the fresh footprints surrounding our tents, I wasn't so sure anymore. They were big, too big to be ours, and there were too many, as if something had been walking around us while we were sleeping. My heart started beating faster. I bent down and ran my hand over one of the markings. It was deep, too deep for a human to do walking normally, and they weren't random. They formed a perfect circle around our camp, as if someone or something had been watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I walked over Lucas' tent and whispered his name. Lucas stirred inside his sleeping bag. "What's up? Go out now." There was something in my voice that must have warned him that it wasn't a joke. He crawled out of the tent and looked around. His face turned pale when he saw the footprints. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the ground, then at the forest, as if he was expecting to see something move through the trees. "You think it's an animal?" I asked. Although he was already, I knew the answer. He shook his head slowly. "Then what?" "I don't know." I didn't hesitate. "Let's wake the others." Moving quickly, we shook Jake and Sarah. They protested at first, but when they saw the footprints, they woke up completely. "What the hell?" Jake muttered. "Who would be walking around here in the middle of the night?" whispered Sarah, crossing her arms. Lucas didn't answer. He just looked at the woods. At that moment we heard a snap, a sound of a branch breaking under the weight of something or someone. The sound was coming from the darkness. We froze. Another crunch closer, this time, and then the sound of deliberate slow footsteps. Something or someone was approaching. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, pointing towards the trees. The ace of light cut through the darkness, but it didn't go far enough. Just shadows, just more forest, but we knew something. Something was there. Something was we have to go, Lucas whispered. I nodded without wasting any time. We began to hurriedly pack what we could, but as we did so, the footsteps came closer, stronger, faster. Something was moving between the trees. Without hesitation, we began to run. The path was dark. The flashlight was shaking in my hand as we advanced behind us. The footsteps followed, but we never saw anything. Only the sound of something moving in the shadow. Then when we reached the creek, the noise stopped. The forest was silent, too quiet. I didn't wait to see what it meant. We ran. We ran until we saw the car. We got inside. We closed the doors and drove off while the lights lit up the road. I looked back. There was nothing. Just the empty forest. But I felt it. It was still there. Waiting. We didn't go back to camp after that, and we never went back to that forest. The first time I heard it, I thought it was an echo. It was deep in the canyon, several miles into a trail I'd never explored before. It was the kind of place where silence envelopes you, where the only sounds are your own footsteps and the occasional whisper of the wind. That's what made it so strange. I was completely alone, and yet every word I said, every sound I made, came back to me too quickly, too perfect. As if someone was repeating it. It all started with something simple. I was standing on the edge of a rock formation, admiring the view, when you murmur, "Wow, this place is amazing." Almost instantly, I heard it again. "Go, this place is amazing." A voice repeated it, but it sounded different. It looked like my voice, but not quite like someone else was saying it. I stopped, feeling a chill run down my spine that didn't. It was a normal echo. The sound was too clear, too close, as if someone was right behind me. Imitating my words, I turned around, expecting to see another hiker standing there. But the trail was empty, just rocks, bushes, and canyon walls rising around me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the uneasiness that was beginning to settle in my chest. The echoes were normal in the canyons. True, the sound was bouncing strangely shaped rock walls, making it sound different. I convinced myself it was just that, and I kept going, and walking. The trail went deeper into the canyon. The walls narrowing, casting long shadows on the road down here. It was colder. The sun barely reached the ground. The air felt thicker, and every step I took resonated louder than it should. About 30 minutes later, I stopped to take an eye, sat down on a big rock in a tight bend of the trail, feeling thirsty and tired. The strange echo from before I had almost forgotten. I took out my water bottle. I took a long swig and mumbled, "What the hell was that?" Before I could even process it, the voice came back. "What the hell was that?" This time louder, clearer, closer. "Freeze. That wasn't an echo." I had responded too fast. Too fast. It was perfectly as if someone was there imitating my words a second after I said them. But I was alone. I knew. I looked around with my heart hammering in my chest. The path was empty. The canyon walls towered above me, casting dark shadows. I scanned every corner, every crevice in the rock. Nothing. But the silence. The silence was too deep, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. With my nerves on end, I grabbed my things and continued walking faster. This time keeping my head down, concentrating on the path, convincing myself that I was exaggerating. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I began to hear the footsteps. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible on the sound of my own footsteps. But as I accelerated the pace, they did too. It was not my imagination. There was someone but walking behind me. I stopped suddenly. The footsteps stopped. The silence fell back on the barrel, heavy as a blanket. I held my breath. Agus the ear. Nothing. I took a breath of air and walked again, this time more cautiously. The footsteps came back. Every time I advanced I heard them behind me. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt it. Something was following me. My pulse shot up, quickened. El Paso almost. Trotting now, the canyon walls felt narrower, the air heavier. It was then that the voice spoke again. This time I wasn't repeating my words. This time it asked me a question. Why are you running? I stumbled, almost falling. My lungs, they closed in panic. I turned suddenly, scanning the path with my eyes bulging. Nothing. But the voice had been so close. I didn't answer. I didn't try to reason. I just started running. The footsteps behind me also rushed faster. Heavier they approached. But every time I turned, the path was empty. Fear drove me. My heart hammered in my ears. My legs burned from the effort. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then the voice called again. Come back. I ignored the terror that pressed on my chest and kept running. Canyon walls were starting to open. I could see the sky. The exit was close. You can't leave. The voice sounded behind me, right in my ear. They pulled me forward with all my strength, feeling an unnatural cold run down my back. The path opened. At last the sunlight hit my face. When I came out to the plateau, it collapsed on my knees, panting, my body trembling with pure fear. The air up here, it was different. Lighter, less stifling. The wind was blowing gently over the rocks, and for the first time in what seemed like hours I heard normal sounds. The distant song of a bird, the whisper of the breeze. The footsteps had stopped. The voice was gone. Finally I stood up with trembling legs, looked back. The canyon was calm, the path empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, hidden in the shadows, waiting. I don't know how long I stood on the plateau watching the trail, waiting to see something appear. But the canyon remained silent, as if it had never spoken. I walked away without looking back. I never returned to that trail to this day. I don't know what it was that I heard down there, or who or what was imitating me. I only know one thing: since then, never I felt lonely in a canyon again. Even when the trail is empty, I can't shake the feeling that something is listening, waiting just out of sight. Being in the water at night always had a particular calm, a stillness different from what you experience on land. The lake stretched out in all directions under the faint glow of the moon, and we were the only ones there. Just Jake, my friend, and I, with the immensity of the water around us. The murmur of the boat's engine was the only sound that broke the silence. As we moved away from the shore, the dark water and Lisa reflecting the sky, Jake was at the helm, guiding us to the center of the lake, where we could turn off the engine and just sit and enjoy the peace of the night. It was something we did every summer, our little getaway, without distractions, without phones, just the water and stars above us. But that night the tranquility we used to find in solitude soon turned into something else, something I couldn't explain. We had been on the lake for about an hour when it started. At first it was somewhat subtle. The boat's radio suddenly turned on with a burst of static. Jake and I stood motionless, exchanging confused looks. We hadn't touched it, and we were too far away from any radio station to pick up signal, especially at this time of night. That's weird, Jake muttered, leaning over to adjust the dial. The static increased in volume, mixed with distant voices as if someone was talking, but too far away to understand the words. He turned the knob from side to side, but the noise only grew. The voices became sharper, though still distorted, as if coming from underwater. He is picking up a signal, I asked, trying to ignore the growing discomfort that settled in my stomach. I don't know. Jake frowned. I shouldn't hear. There's no signal. The static continued, the voices getting louder, but still unintelligible. It didn't sound like any radio station I'd ever listened to before. There was something unsettling about it, something almost desperate. And then, suddenly, the static was cut off completely. The ensuing silence was overwhelming. Jake and I fixated on the radio, anticipating a shift, yet the atmosphere remained utterly still. With a swift motion, Jake pressed the button and switched it off. He mentioned that it's likely just some interference. Although his voice didn't sound very convinced, maybe he's approaching a storm or something. I nodded, though I didn't believe it either. The sky was clear, the water was calm, there was no sign of a storm. No reason for the radio to act like that. We were silent for a while, the tension between us getting denser. The engine was off, and we just floated, the boat swaying gently with the current. The usual stillness of the lake was no longer comforting. Now it felt oppressive. Then we heard it, a faint sound, like a voice calling from across the water. At first I thought I had imagined it. It was as soft as if the wind had carried a distant echo. But then it came back louder this time, and it was no doubt a human voice. "You heard that?" I asked in a whisper. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Yes, I heard him." We both turned in the direction of the sound, squinting in the gloom. The lake stretched out before us, only the reflection of the moon on the surface. There was no one there, no other boat, no light, nothing. "Maybe someone is stranded," Jake suggested. I inquired, uncertainty tinging my voice. "Is there security here?" "There's no one in sight." The voice responded once more, sharper this time. It was a man's voice, laced with tension, as if he were pleading for assistance. The voice echoed even nearer, yet no one was in sight. It felt as though the sound originated from all directions, bouncing off the water's surface. A shiver coursed through me. This felt all wrong. It was beneficial. The scream was louder, more urgent. I don't know how to go and see," I asked, although the thought of getting closer made me shudder. "Jack." But then he nodded slowly. "We can't leave someone here if they really need help." He started the engine and the boat. He moved slowly to where we thought the voice was coming from. The flashlight was still scanning the water, but there was nothing. The sound came back louder. My heart was pounding as he grabbed me at the edge of the boat, my knuckles white with tension. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voice stopped. The boat floated in the water, the engine whizzing at idle. We stood in complete silence, the light of the flashlight bouncing off the black surface of the lake. No voice, no movement, nothing where it went. I whispered more to myself than to Jake. He shook his head, his jaw tense. "No, I know." We waited what seemed like an eternity. The boat was rocking gently with the waves, the engine vibrating weakly, but the voice didn't come back. The lake had returned to its absolute silence, as if nothing had happened. Just as I was going to suggest we go back, the radio came on again. This time the static was louder, more aggressive. A high-pitched sound filtered through the interference, a screech that made my ears hurt, and then among the static we heard a little more voices, but not one, several talking at the same time, superimposed, accelerated, as if overlapping, one with the other in a tangle of incomprehensible words. Jake tried to adjust the dial, but no matter what he did, the noise just grew. It was as if the radio was broadcasting something we shouldn't be hearing. I leaned in, trying to make out the words, and then a voice cut off the noise. Unmistakable. "Clara, go away." My heart skipped a beat. Jake and I locked eyes. Words were unnecessary. With a powerful roar, the engine sprang to life, propelling us forward as we set sail. A wave of relief washed over me. As we made contact with the shore, the radio fell silent, and the lake settled into an eerie tranquility, yet we sensed that something was amiss. There was an unsettling presence surrounding us, and I wished we weren't in that moment together. We never returned to that lake. After a challenging week at work, I opted for a familiar trail that wound through thick woods, ultimately leading to a serene, hidden spot by a stream. I had visited that place previously, but never when the sun had set. There was something about that place that had always caused me some uneasiness. When night fell, I couldn't pinpoint what it was, maybe just the common feeling of being alone in nature, the vulnerability that comes with it, but now sitting by the fire with the shadows lengthening around me, I wasn't so sure. The campfire crackled softly, projecting shadows across the clearing. The trees rose tall and dark, their branches swaying in the night breeze should have, but instead I felt something watching me. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the sensation. It was just paranoia. I was alone in the middle of the forest, far from civilization. The only thing that had changed was that the sun had set. It was salty. True, and then I heard it, a faint crack coming from somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing. It was a subtle sound barely perceptible over the crackle of the fire. But I was there, something moving through the undergrowth. I stood completely still, my heart hammering against my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and pointed the light towards the forest. Nothing. Just the trees motionless in the breeze. Exhale slowly, my pulse still racing. I was probably just a deer, maybe a raccoon. Curious about the campfire, nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood up the flashlight, still shaking in my hand as I ran the light along the edge of the clearing. The crackling had ceased, but the air was charged, tense. As if the forest itself was waiting. I should have packed my things and returned to my car at that moment. But the thought of walking alone on a dark path seemed even more terrifying than staying in the clearing. So I sat down again, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing right at the edge of the clearing. Hidden behind the trees, my heart stopped. I turned the flashlight quickly to her, but by the time the light hit the trees, there was nothing there. I stood up immediately. "Hello," I called in a voice firmer than I felt inside. "There's someone there." Silence. The campfire was still crackling softly, but the forest was completely calm, too calm. I waited for an answer, some sound, some sign that what I had seen was just a trick of my mind, but nothing. And still, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I saw something, someone. Swallowed hard and forced myself to sit down again, although my muscles were tense, ready to run away at any moment. I told myself that I would wait a little longer, let the fire burn out a bit, and then take my backpack and walk to my car. But before I could move, the crackle came back louder, this time closer. I immediately pointed the flashlight at the trees, and there was the closest figure, now standing right on the line where the firelight faded into the darkness. It was tall, unusually tall, thin. The shape was indistinct, a dark silhouette against the trees. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes above me. I stood motionless with the air trapped in my lungs, and then the figure moved, not towards me, but back into the woods with an almost unnatural slowness, slid through the trees, disappearing into the darkness without making a sound. My brain aba a single thing: I ran. I grabbed my backpack without I cared if I left anything behind, and put out the campfire with the rest of the water I had left. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if the figure was still there, waiting in the shadows. I just ran. The path was narrow and winding, the trees closing in around me as I went as fast as I could. My flashlight flickered, batteries running out, sending erratic flashes of light through the trees. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of the wind made my heart beat faster. I felt something was following me, but I didn't dare look. I didn't stop, not until I saw the glare of my headlights in the distance. I stumbled out of the woods, my breath ragged, my legs trembling. I threw my backpack in the back seat, got in the car, and locked the doors. Only when I started the engine and walked away from the trail did I feel that I could breathe again. I never knew what it was that I saw that night. I don't know if it was a man, an animal, or something else, but I know one thing: I'll never go back to that path. Some parts of the forest must be left alone, and sometimes the silence of nature isn't as empty as it seems. There's a certain tension in the air when you're lost that you can't quite explain, an invisible weight that clings to you that makes every sound feel sharper, every shadow darker. That's exactly what I felt the night I took a wrong turn on a trail that I thought I knew like the back of my hand. Was supposed to be a short, easy hike. I'd done it dozens of times before, but somehow I found myself off the trail with the forest closing in around me and the quickly sinking behind the trees. What started as a quiet afternoon soon turned into something more, something I wish I had never experienced. I had started the hike late in the morning, thinking I had time to spare before dark. The trail meandered through dense wood, not far from the small town where I lived, and I knew it well. It wasn't marked on any official map, but it had been a local secret for years, a hidden corner of the world where you could walk for hours without seeing another soul. But that day something felt different. I noticed it when I was halfway there. The air that had been warm and pleasant suddenly felt colder, and the forest around me seemed darker, as if the trees were casting shadows too soon. I looked at the sky, surprised to see the sun already down on the horizon. I hadn't realized how much time had passed. I should have returned at that point, but instead I kept going, convinced that I could finish the circuit before dark. That was my mistake. As I advanced the trail, The well-marked path I had always followed began to blur. It seemed to fade into the undergrowth, and the trees felt closer, as if they were closing around me. I slowed down, squinting my eyes to that I used to use a crooked tree here, a bunch of stones there, but everything looked the same, just endless trees and long shadows. A thought began to form in the back of my mind. I'm lost. I shook my head. I knew this trail. I could find my way back. I quickened my pace, ignoring the growing sense of unease that crept into my chest. But after another 20 minutes of walking, I had that admitting it was really lost. I stopped in the middle of the trail, or what I thought was the trail, and slowly turned on my heels. The forest around me was motionless, a strange silence, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. There were no birds singing. There was no wind in the leaves. There was no distant buzz of insects. Nothing, just the sound of my own breath, and the faintness of the leaves under. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction seemed identical, dark and twisted trees and a sky that was getting dark. Quickly, I took out my phone, hoping to use the GPS with no signal. Of course, the battery was low, and I knew I had to keep it in case I needed the flashlight later. I looked at the time. 6:45 am. Sun would go out soon, and I had no intention of spending the night in the woods. I turned and started walking in the direction I thought it would take me back, hurrying my pace as the shadows lengthened on the ground. But no matter how far I walked, the landscape didn't change. The trees seemed to close even more. The air grew colder with each step. I felt like I was walking in circles, and then just as the last strip of sunlight disappeared between the trees, I saw a cabin was in a small clearing, barely visible through the thick undergrowth. The wood was old and worn, the roof sunken in the middle, and the windows dark and empty. It seemed abandoned, forgotten by time, as if it had been there for years, waiting for someone to find it. I doubted with my heart to hold it tightly in my chest. I had never seen this cabin before. It was not on the path I knew, but there it was, standing into the stillness of the forest as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't want to get closer. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away. But I was lost, and the darkness was setting in fast. I needed shelter, or at least a place to reorganize my thoughts. Maybe something would go up inside that could help me. A map, a working phone. I took a deep breath and pushed through the bushes, getting closer to the cabin. The air became colder as I got closer, and the silence, it got even heavier. When I got to the door, I hesitated, my hand floating on the rusty metal knob. The wood felt damp under my fingers. The smell loved and decay hung in the air. I pushed. The door squealed as it opened, the sound echoing in the stillness. I took a step inside. The inside was small and empty, with a few pieces of broken furniture scattered around the room. One dusty table in the center, a chair dropped sideways, and a cracked mirror hanging on the opposite wall. The air was heavy with dust, and the floor creaked under my boots as I went. There was no sign of life, no belongings, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there in years. Just an old, abandoned cabin in the middle of the forest. I exhaled a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. I had hoped to find something useful, but here there was nothing. I turned to leave, and then I heard it, a soft sound, a creak of floorboards coming from another side of the cabin. My heart stopped. I stood motionless, listening to the forest. It was still silent, but that sound, I hadn't imagined it. I looked at a corner of the cabin that I hadn't noticed before, a small corridor with a threadbare curtain, almost hidden in the gloom. The sound came another, as if something was moving right behind the curtain. I took a step back, my hand squeezing the flashlight. I didn't want to know what was there. I needed to get out now. But then I heard it, a whisper coming from behind the curtain. Pen inside my blood froze. The voice was soft, almost kind, but it filled me with a fear so pure that I could hardly breathe. I backed, my mind screaming at me to run the hut. The shadows seemed to darken, lengthening on the ground. I turned and ran, stumbling over the door, out into the cold night air. I ran non-stop, the forest blurring around me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if something was following me. I just ran. When I finally found I walked and saw the distant lights of the village collapsing by air. I didn't find that cabin again. No matter how many times I went back to the forest, I never found the trail that took me there. It was like I had disappeared. But sometimes on quieter nights, I still hear that voice, a soft whisper in the back of my mind, come inside, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. Considered a rational person, the kind who needs explanations, facts, and reasons to put your mind at ease. But what happened to me that weekend at the lake has no explanation. I wasn't one of those who believe in the supernatural or those ghost stories that are told around a campfire, but after that night I'm not so sure what I think. I think it all started with Invitation from my friend Alex. I had been talking wonders about a secluded cabin that his family had recently bought, located right on the shore of a large lake with crystal clear waters. He told me that it was the perfect place to relax and unwind. I am not one of those who refuse a weekend in the woods, fishing, making campfires. Maybe a few drinks sounded perfect. The trip was longer than I expected. It was in a place, motorcycle, kilometers, on a narrow and winding road that it went deeper into the woods than I felt prepared for. When the sun came, it was already beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the lake. The cabin was among the trees with a dock that stretched over the calm water. It was Pacific, almost too peaceful. Alex and some friends were already there on the porch with drinks in hand. The first night went as we planned, laughter around the sound of the lake caressing the shore and the wind between the trees. But it was the second night when things started to get strange. The day had passed without incident. We spent most of the time swimming in the lake, resting on the dock and enjoying the silence that comes with being so far away from everything. At sunset we decided to go inside for dinner. The atmosphere was relaxed, all in a good mood, with no indication that anything was out of place. But after dinner Alex suggested something that took me by surprise. "Have you ever heard of the Lady of the Lake?" he asked in a low voice, as if he was setting the mood for a horror story. We all looked at him, intrigued but skeptical. I could already tell that he was preparing us for one of those typical campfire stories. But there was something in her look, something that made me think that maybe she wasn't making it up at the time, was a local woman from the 30s, or maybe before, I'm not sure. The story says that she lived somewhere on the shore of the lake, and that she used to walk along the shore every night waiting for her husband to return from a fishing trip. But one night he didn't come back. They found his boat overturned at the far end of the lake, but they never found her body. The room fell silent while Alex paused, scanning our faces with his eyes. The only thing that could be heard was the crackling of the fire in the fireplace. After that, she continued, people began to see her, always walking along the shore, after dark. They say that she still wanders the lake looking for her husband, and that sometimes if you're in the water late enough, you can hear her calling it. I didn't believe it, but the atmosphere had definitely changed. Alex's storytelling had an uncanny ability to send chills down my spine. It was merely a ghost story, sure, just a tale spun to add a touch of intrigue to a location. Yet, as I reflected on it later that night, I found myself questioning everything. Alone on the dock, I gazed up at the moon, its luminous glow spilling over the lake. The water lay perfectly still, reflecting the night like a sheet of glass. I'm not quite sure what led me to that place. Perhaps it was Alex's tale lingering in my thoughts, or maybe it was simply the stillness that enveloped me. As I lingered in that moment, I found myself captivated by the water's gentle flow and the symphony of nighttime sounds. And then, just like that, I was fully present. A faint splash echoed, suggesting that something or someone had disrupted the tranquil surface of the water. Though it wasn't a loud sound, in the quiet of the night, it was impossible to overlook. I shut my eyes, gazing at the lake, where the surface mirrored Lisa, capturing the moonlight flawlessly. Despite convincing myself it was likely just a fish or a branch splashing into the water, that unsettling feeling from earlier started to creep back in. I was about to turn around and go back to the cabin when I saw it movement near the other shore, just beyond the range of the light of the dock. At first, it was just a ripple barely noticeable in the darkness, but as I looked it grew as if something was swimming, not moving, towards the center of the lake. Blinking it, I was seeing things, but when I looked again, the figure was still there, closer now. It was a woman. She was standing in waist-deep water. Her long dark hair stuck to her back, her dress, or what appeared to be a dress, floated around her legs, moving gently with the current. She wasn't looking at me. Instead, she was facing the far end of the lake with her head tilted slightly as if she were hearing something. My heart started pounding. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick, an illusion caused by moonlight or the reflection of trees. But no matter how many times I blink or rub my eyes, she was still there. And then she moved slowly. She began to move deeper into the lake with slow, deliberate movements, as if looking for something just below the surface. The water covered her up to her chest, but she didn't stop. I wanted to call her, ask her if she needed help, but the words didn't come out. I was frozen, anchored to the ground, my mind racing through confusion and fear. And then, just as it reached the deepest part of the lake, it stopped for a long moment, stood there, its head turned, barely as if it heard anything. And then, without warning, it sank. I let out a Gasp! Taking an involuntary step forward, the lake was still again, perfectly smooth, as if nothing would have happened. There was no trace of it, no bubbles, no ripples, nothing. I stood there for what seemed like hours, looking at the place where it disappeared, waiting for it to come back to the surface, but the lake remained silent. Finally, I turned on my heels and ran back to the cabin, my heart hammered on my chest. I closed the door tightly, turning the lock with trembling hands. The others were still asleep, oblivious to that had just happened. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't at dawn. I didn't mention anything to Alex or the others. I didn't talk about the woman or what I saw, partly because I didn't want to believe it really happened. But as we packed to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lady of the lake was still there, waiting. Maybe the story of Al, no, it wasn't just a story after all. And maybe some places, no matter how peaceful they may seem, hide secrets that are better not to disturb.